This morning we're going to be diving back into our series in Numbers, and Chris gave me the wonderful passage of Numbers 25. And if you don't know me, my name is Zach Jones. I'm the worship pastor here. Chris is on vacation this week, and so our prayers go to him that he has a peaceful time. And he's going to come back and be all fired up because he didn't preach for 1 week, so y'all just brace yourself for next week. So I'm going to read through Numbers 25. Let's stand up for this first little section, and I'll have you sit down while I read through the rest. But I think it's good to stand up and honor the word as we start. So this first little section goes, while Israel was staying in the acacia grove, the people began to prostitute themselves with the women of Moab. The women invited them to sacrifice for their gods, and the people ate, bowed, and worshiped to their gods. So Israel aligned itself with Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger may turn away from Israel. So Moses told Israel's judges, kill each of the men who align themselves with Baal of Peor. You may be seated. I'm going to keep reading, though, because this story is just getting started. In verse 6 it says, an Israelite man came, bringing a Midianite woman to his relatives in the sight of Moses and the whole community, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he got up from the assembly, took a spear in his hand, followed the Israelite man into the tent, and drove it through both the Israelite man and the woman through her belly. Then the plague on the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord spoke to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites, because he was zealous among them with my zeal, so that I did not destroy the Israelites in my zeal. Therefore, declare, I grant him my covenant of peace. It will be a covenant of perpetual priesthood for him and his future descendants, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites. The name of the slain Israelite man who was struck dead with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. The name of the slain Midianite woman was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, a tribal head of a family in Midian. The Lord told Moses, attack the Midianites and strike them dead, for they attacked you with the treachery that they used against you in the Peor incident. They did the same in the case involving their sister Cosbi, daughter of the Midianite leader, who was killed the day the plague came at Peor. That is an interesting story. And you don't actually hear about it a whole lot, because the biggest question is, what are we supposed to do with this when we read this in the Bible? Read something like this that seems kind of crazy. Seems really almost extreme to some of us with our modern sensibilities and our modern context. But it's in the Bible, right? So if it's in the Bible, it probably has a purpose for our discipleship. So we get to dive into it. And so as we dive into something like this, I think there's a couple of initial things that we need to get at as we dive into this passage. Oh yeah. Sorry, they're waving these at the back. If you don't have one of these, I have notes that I'm trying to pull up on the screen. My clicker's not working, guys, so I don't know what's going on. You'll have to follow along. But I have notes that have fill in the blanks for you. One of the reasons I do this is I'm going to cover a lot of material. If you don't have notes, raise your hand if you'd like some, and some of our ushers will bring them. Got some? Yeah, keep your hand up till you get them. They were looking and they missed you. But yeah, so here we go. Let's see. All right, Caleb, you're going to have fun following me along. My clicker's not working. All right, so when we get into this, the first thing we want to ask is, who is the audience of this? And so Numbers was written to the second generation of Israelites after the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, so that first blank is second generation. This was Moses' attempt to help them not make the same mistakes as their parents' generation. It was an opportunity to learn from the mistakes of Israel's past. It's really, I think it's really important for us to understand that Numbers was something that was almost like a sermon that was preached to that second generation. It recounts their story and stuff. And so it starts actually talking about the first generation, and it recounts their failures. But what we see is happening is this story takes place. So the second question is, where is it? This story takes place on the plains of Moab, which is right before they enter the promised land. They've been wandering in the desert for quite a few years, quite a few decades actually. And so as they get ready to enter the promised land, they don't know that they're getting ready to enter the promised land. So the first generation has heard all the promises. They failed several times. And I think there's something in their hearts that's saying, hey, when can I get that blessing that was said that I would have? And so lastly, it's good to understand that when this takes place right before that. And so there is a transition happening from that first generation to the second generation. But they are on the cusp of going into the promised land. Then also, I think it's good to understand that this passage is narrative on your next blank. It's narrative. It is descriptive, not prescriptive, right? It is describing things that happen. Now, this does not mean that we can't learn how we should live, how we should act from the passage. Well, what it does mean is that we need to be careful, because sometimes the Bible will just tell us things that happen, and then it will tell them in a way that condemns them. But if we're just reading along, we're like, well, it's in the Bible, it must be okay. No, the Bible was saying that's a bad thing to do, okay? So when we look at a passage like this, it's good for us to see what happens in the text, but it's also good for us to understand how the text judges the actions that it conveys. And this passage, though there's some crazy stuff that happens in it, the Bible actually comments on it in very specific ways. So we know how to understand the significance of this. Okay? Now, as we approach this, one of the important textual parallels, so there's a fancy word combination for you, a textual parallel. So in the Bible, sometimes things happen and they're recorded that echo other events, or that almost seem to repeat in significant ways other events. And so a fancy term for this is a textual parallel, and it is Numbers 25 with the golden calf incident. And I want to read some of this because there's some stuff in this passage. I'm going to read sections of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. That very intriguingly parallel and in a sense kind of set up what happens at Peor. So the first little section, it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down from the mountain. Y'all remember this? He's up at the mountain getting the Ten Commandments. They gathered around Aaron and said to him, come, make gods for us who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So Aaron said to them, well, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters and bring them to me. So all the people took off the gold rings that were on their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, fashioned it with an engraving tool, and made it into an image of a calf. Then they said to Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it and made an announcement. There will be a festival to the Lord tomorrow. You see this kind of, they're mixing like idol worship with God worship. Like they're way off their rocker here. Early in the next morning, they arose, offered burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. And the Lord spoke to Moses, go down at once, for your people you brought up. This is like the situation where it's like your son did this and you're going to deal with it. So God's like, your people, for your people you brought up from the land of Egypt have acted corruptly. They have quickly turned away from the way I commanded them. They have made for themselves an image of a calf. They have bowed down to it, sacrificed to it, and said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. I'm going to skip down a little bit. And so Moses and God talk, and he's like begging God not to just annihilate everybody. It says, then Moses turned and went down the mountains with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, Joshua was with Moses. That's really interesting. And so he says, there's the sound of war in the camp. But Moses replied, it's not the sound of a victory cry and not the sound of a cry of defeat. I hear the sound of singing. As he approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses became enraged. He threw the tablets out of his hands, smashing them at the base of the mountain. He took the calf they had made, burned it, ground it to powder, and then he scattered the powder over the surface of the water and forced the Israelites to drink the water. Moses saw, and this is skipping down to verse 25, Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, making them a laughingstock to their enemies. The text is aware of the people's esteem in the nations around them. And it's pointing out that their actions had made the people of God a laughingstock. And Moses stood at the camp's entrance and said, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. And all the Levites gathered around him. He told them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. Every man fasten his sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from entrance to entrance, and each of you kill his brother, his friend, and his neighbor. And the Levites did as Moses commanded, and about 3,000 men fell dead that day among the people. Afterward, Moses said, today you, he's talking to the Israelites, have been dedicated to the Lord, since each man went against his son and his brother. Therefore you have brought a blessing on yourselves today. That's another interesting passage, isn't it? And I think as we dive into the story at Peor, we'll see some of the things that were working in that other passage from Exodus. But I wanted you to see that the things that are happening here, this is not the first time that this has happened. And so some of the commands that God gave the Israelites after that first incident were supposed to actually help keep them from what happens here. And that was also a first-generation incident. That was the first generation that came out of Egypt. Like the former generation that died in the wilderness, the new generation had to learn the most important lesson concerning God and their relationship to Him. That He is and always will be holy, and that He will not allow idolatry to go unreproved. Now, the last time that Pastor Chris preached from Numbers, we had the stories of Balaam and Balak. And this story right here is actually connected to that. And in most commentaries, all of the chapters of Balaam, Balak, and this incident, chapter 25, they're all connected together. And really good question to ask is, why? Why would scholars and other people who study the Bible, why would they connect them? And that's because Balaam, Mr. Devious himself, is still at work behind the scenes here. So if you look in 2 Peter 2:15, you don't see Balaam's name in Numbers 25. But look at this. 2 Peter 2:15. They have gone astray by abandoning the straight path and have followed the path of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of wickedness. Revelation 2:14, going all the way to the end of the Bible, it says, but I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to place a stumbling block in front of the Israelites, to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. So at this point, when John wrote Revelation, the story of Balaam had been percolating in Israel's history so long that it had become representative of a certain type of idolatry and a certain type of practice. So what did Balaam do? All right, go to Numbers 31. This is the one that kind of lays it out. Numbers 31:16. It says, "Yet they are the ones who, at Balaam's advice, incited the Israelites to unfaithfulness against the Lord in the Peor incident, so that the plague came against the Lord's community." So, here's what happened. This is what went on behind the scenes that we don't see. It's between Numbers 24 and Numbers 25. Is Balaam couldn't curse the Israelites. God protected His people. The covenantal blessing that God had put on Israel was protecting them from all external forces. You couldn't even curse the Israelites. But Balaam was like, hey, Balak, I can't curse them, but let me tell you what you need to do. And the advice that Balaam gave to Balak was how to get the Israelites to undermine their covenantal relationship with God. And he gave them some very simple instructions. It was, hey, go grab the Moabites. They got some pretty girls over there. Invite the Israelites over to have some food and drink. And you know what? Them Israelites, they'll fall into sin. That's all you got to do. And they did. So the greatest threat to Israel was not an external threat. This is your next blank. It says, the greatest threat to Israel was its covenant Lord when it harbored sin within the camp. That's convicting, right? That weighs on me a little bit, makes me examine my heart. Let's dive into where the Israelites went wrong. So Numbers 25, 1-3. While Israel was staying in the acacia grove, the people began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab. The women invited them to the sacrifices for the gods, and the people ate and bowed and worshiped to their gods. So Israel aligned itself, I think the Hebrew word is yoked. They yoked themselves with Baal of Peor. That was, you know how in the Old Testament they talk, Baal is one of those gods that the Israelites continually stray towards? That's this one. That's this one. So Israel aligned itself with the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. And so looking in the text, you have three areas the Israelites failed in. First, and this is kind of in the order that they're revealed in the text. The first one that's really obvious is immorality. They specifically sexual immorality. Second is idolatry. They were participating in the worship of Baal. And third is gluttony. Now, I want to say that gluttony here is kind of representative of a specific idea in the text and in the story. I want you to listen to this. So Josephus was a historian from way back. And so he talks about Zimri. You remember the guy that is stabbed later on in this story? So he talks about Zimri in his histories. And he wrote that Zimri expressed his contempt for Moses, called Moses a worse oppressor than Pharaoh, and said that Moses was trying to deprive the Israelites of the sweetness of life, which consists in acting according to our own wills and is the right of free men and those who have no lord over them. That sounds kind of familiar. He accused Moses of acting under pretense of laws and of God wickedly to impose on us slavery and gain dominion to himself. So he was saying, hey, Moses, we should be free to do what we want to do, to please ourselves however we want to please ourselves, to make ourselves happy. We should be free to be happy. So don't be imposing your laws. You're acting super religious, man, super legalistic, like back off and let me do my thing. And that right there, that sounds really close to home. Like, I hear that on the TV. I see that on Twitter. I see that on Facebook, right? I hear that echoed in my heart sometimes. I mean, to be honest, I do. And so the weakness, and this is the next couple of blanks, the weakness Balaam exploited was their elevation of personal pleasure over covenantal faithfulness. Let me say that again. The weakness that Balaam exploited with God's people was their elevation of personal pleasure over covenantal faithfulness. The Israelites were quite literally invited to come party with the Midianites. Specifically, Balaam knew that the Israelites would be susceptible to extravagant foods on offer by the Moabites, and also that the Moabite women would be attractive and tempting to the Israelite men. Okay? So we kind of get the reverse order of how things were happening. Started with them more than anything else offering food to the Israelites. These were people that had been wandering through the desert for almost 40 years at this point and had been eating manna every day and like meat on the weekends or whatever. Okay? So their diet was pretty sparse. Okay? So the Midianites are like, hey, come over, we got food, we got fun. And then the girls that they sent to invite them were pretty attractive, and all the Israelite guys were like, man, it looks like a fun time. And so he went on over there. And so this is why I think it's good for us to remember that this was happening right before the Israelites went into the promised land. I guarantee you the Israelites were starting to be like, God, hey, when? Like, when do we get to that promised land? When do we get the land of milk and honey? Because right now I got manna, and I've had manna since I was born, okay? God, I'd really like a good steak dinner, some mashed potatoes, like, give me something new. And then these locals come up and say, hey, come on over, we're having a festival, and we got some good food. They didn't say is the festival was a party to their God. And so they went over and started eating, and next thing you know, they're starting to participate. And like some of the scholars that I was reading were saying that to participate, some of the Israelites actually probably had to go to get like a special dispensation from the priests of the Moabs and stuff to participate in these festivals and stuff. Like at the point that they started worshiping, it wasn't like everybody in the room was worshiping. They're like, oh, maybe I should. They went out of their ways to participate. Like they were hanging out so long that they said, hey, I want to do that. Can I do that? And they're like, hang on, let me go check. Oh, you got to do this, and then you can do that. And, okay, I'll do that. And so while they got drawn in, every step of the way they decided against God and for themselves to participate. In Exodus 34, there's an interesting command, and it feels really harsh. It says, do not make a treaty with the inhabitants of the land, or else when they prostitute themselves with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. Then you will take some of their daughters as brides for your sons. The daughters will prostitute themselves with their gods, and cause your sons to prostitute themselves with their gods. Number 25, I would say this is that moment. God said, don't make a treaty with these people. And he was not doing that because he's a mean God who hates people. He's doing that because he's a loving God who wants to protect those who are his. Because he knew that even a treaty with the locals would result in the end with his people being led astray. Because they disobeyed that command, 24,000 people died. That weighs on you, doesn't it? One of the things I want to point out in this, I don't want to dwell on it, but when the Israelites were participating in the worship of this God, they weren't just doing things, but the things that we do, specifically rituals that we enact when we worship, they orient our heart in the world. Okay? We don't just sing songs on Sunday morning to make you feel good about being here. And I hope you understand that. Our team works hard to pick songs that orient our heart correctly to God and help us rejoice in him properly. Okay? And as we sing those songs, not only are we participating physically in an activity and focusing on a way of knowing God, but we're doing it together as God's people. Coming together unites us and reminds us that we don't walk alone. And when we sing together, we are embodying and enacting out the unity of the body. I know some people sometimes struggle to sing on Sunday morning because they're like, I don't have a good voice. Hey, I don't care. Being here, participating, it is a part of living out your faith. And it shapes you, and it shapes your neighbor. It enables you to be a Christian. It enables you to know God correctly. But these people, these Israelites, they were among other people with their people worshiping their God, enacting those practices. And they were warping, literally deforming their way of knowing God. And it was leading them astray. Okay, first the food. They put themselves in a place where, it's just food, it's not so bad. Next thing you know, well, hey, everybody else is kind of doing this thing. It looks kind of fun, and they got more food, and the girls are kind of pretty, and they look like they're doing fun stuff, and go in there. Next thing you know, they're in there, and when this specific worship included sexual activity, okay? So when the Israelites went in and worshiped, they weren't just standing around and singing Kumbaya to another god, okay? It involved sexual promiscuity, sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and all those things. And it was all oriented away from God. And so they were allowing themselves to be shaped and formed by this other people and their worship. And so the judgment of the Lord comes down. Because if the Lord had done nothing, then the entire nation would have been led astray. So the Lord moved to protect his people. And so in Numbers 25, 4-5, the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses told Israel's judges, "Kill each of the men who align themselves with Baal of Peor." Okay? One of the really interesting aspects of this text is when the Lord is commanding Moses, he uses a specific phrase to command Moses here. Do you remember earlier in Numbers where Moses sinned against God in the striking of the rock and that whole incident? Well, before that, God used a specific phrase when he commanded the Israelites through Moses. After that incident, God changed the way that he spoke to Israel, or to Moses. That's really interesting. And here, at the beginning of Numbers 25, when God gives the command, he speaks in this second form. The phrase is in this secondary form. But what happens is, at the end of the passage, when God addresses them, it's in the primary form. There's something that happens that changes Moses' relationship with God and Israel's relationship with God here. God's judgment of the Israelites' sin was focused on preserving the covenantal blessing and protecting the future generations of Israelites from the consequences of this compromise. He wanted to preserve them. He wanted to preserve the blessing that he had given them, the way that he was protecting them. And he wanted to protect them from their compromise. So then in Numbers 25, 6-9, you have the extreme moment. Okay? An Israelite man came bringing a Midianite woman to his relatives in the sight of Moses and the whole Israelite community while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Let me paint the scene. This is the temple. Moses is at the temple with the leaders. The people, probably a lot of them women whose men and whose husbands and sons have been led away by the Moabites. They've come to Moses and the leaders, and they are weeping. Their hearts are broken. Then over here comes this guy bringing a Moabite girl in sight of the temple steps where the people are weeping, and flaunts her with his brother and family, and then takes her into a tent. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he got up from the assembly, took a spear in his hand, followed the Israelite man into the tent, and drove it through both the Israelite man and the woman through her belly. Then the plague on the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. Now you remember when we read from Exodus? You remember what Moses commanded the Levites to do? He told them to kill those, specifically those who had sinned and had worshiped. What's really interesting in here is that Phinehas is a son, a descendant of Aaron. He is a Levite. He is, this was really convicting to me this week. He was acting out the way that he had been taught to deal with sin in the camp. He was stepping up and taking on the priesthood that he knew would be his one day. And he dealt with the sin in the camp exactly like he had seen his forefathers, his parents, and other priests deal with sin in the camp before. That wasn't the passage that we read in Exodus wasn't the only time this had happened. Phinehas had multiple times to learn how to deal with sin in the camp. And when he saw Zimri do this, he knew what to do. And he stepped up and he did it. It seems extreme, but he knew what to do. So Phinehas learned how to deal with sin from his parents and other priests, from his community. This convicts me as a parent because it says, hey, am I teaching my kids to kill sin before it kills them? Like Phinehas was taught. And for all of you young people in here, my question is, are you learning to kill sin lest it be killing you? Because that's one of the things you should be learning right now. So he learned how to deal with sin from his parents and other priests. Phinehas' actions seem extreme, but the way the text is worked, it actually shows that Phinehas' zeal mirrored God's. And so Phinehas represented a new generation. Okay, Phinehas was part of the second generation. He represented a new generation, people ready to commit themselves to the Lord, His worship, His word, and His work. And so there's an interesting echo in this story as I was reading and studying. There are two generations that are trying to wrestle with their faith here, and Phinehas represents the younger generation. And to me, in the story, there's an aspect of Phinehas that I think calls to every young person and teenager under the sound of my voice that says, will you be that Phinehas in your generation? And the call to me as a parent is, are you training your children to be the Phinehas's of their generation? So Numbers 25, 10 through 13. The Lord spoke to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites because he was zealous among them with my zeal, so that I did not destroy the Israelites in my zeal. Therefore, declare, I grant him my covenant of peace. It will be a covenant of perpetual priesthood for him and his future descendants, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites. Now, there's a lot going on there. But the first thing I want to note is how God talks about Phinehas' zeal. We look at what Phinehas did and we're like, man, that is extreme. You went in there and straight up killed those people. Like, you skewered them. Like, literally put a spear right through both of them. Like, that, we don't do that now, okay? But the text doesn't condemn Phinehas' actions. And God does not condemn them. And I think it's good for us to understand in the context of the Old Testament, the covenant of Israel with God, this pattern of sinners being condemned to death and being executed in judgment, functioning in an atoning way for the sins of the people, is a theme in the Old Testament. They had regular sacrifices for the atonement of sin of the people. In this particular instant, there's an atonement that's made with the blood of the sinner. It's an interesting kind of thing functioning in the text. But first, Phinehas' actions were driven by a zeal which mirrored God's own zeal against sin. So when Phinehas was engaging the situation, his heart was in sync, in tune with God's. Consider Psalm 106, 28 to 31. It says, they aligned themselves with Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to lifeless gods. They angered the Lord with their deeds, and a plague broke out against them. But Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stopped. It was credited to him as righteousness throughout all generations to come. Now, I think it's important for us to understand the text is not saying that we should go out and kill sinners like Phinehas did. Okay? This is one of those really important things for us to understand as far as what the text is recording and conveying to us. It is narrative. It is descriptive. This is what Phinehas did. This is how the Lord blessed him for his actions. But embedded in that is this idea of the zeal of the Lord. And so Calvin, I thought, provided a really good kind of balance to approaching this. He says, this incident ought not to be taken as an example from which to draw a general rule. God is free to appoint his servants to whatever special tasks he pleases, and his approval is enough evidence that he himself has called. So, Calvin is saying, we know that God called Phineas to do this because God approved of it. But he says we can conclude without question that Phineas was under divine direction because God declared that the deed pleased him, and this is repeated in Psalm 106, what we just read. But if anyone in a private capacity begins in an excess of zeal to punish like a crime, he cannot plead Phineas's example unless he is truly convinced of his own heavenly commission. We must not forget Christ's answer when his disciples wished to follow the example of Elijah and call down fire on those who had not received him. You know not of what spirit you are. That was Christ's condemnation of it. And says this. He says, if our zeal is to be approved by God, it must be tempered with spiritual wisdom and ruled by God's authority. So, as we look at this and we see God approving Phineas' actions, I think we should also know that Phineas' actions were approved because his heart was in tune with God's. So the challenge to us is to have a heart that is ready to kill sin, not sinners, like Phineas was, but to have a heart that is aligned with God's will for his people and against sin. So we should be tempered by spiritual wisdom and ruled by God's authority. If you look again at Numbers 25, it pulls out what I kind of touched on earlier. It says, it will be a covenant of perpetual priesthood for him and his future descendants because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites. Phineas was blessed by God because his actions embodied the heart of the role of a priest for Israel. Something else was happening in this passage. God wasn't just dealing with Israel's sin, but he was also allowing a new generation of priests to be produced in the fire of tribulation. Okay? This was a priest who mediated between God and his people. Phineas' actions were on behalf of God for the people. And who, through sacrifices, could offer atonement for their sin. Now, interesting, atonement is mentioned in this passage. And I think it's a great moment for us to understand that when we receive the weight of the revelation of sin in our lives, okay? Because I'm reading this and I'm looking at my life and I'm seeing what the Israelites did, and I'm starting to see echoes of their sinful heart in my own. And I'm starting to look at my life and asking, hey, are there areas that I have compromised like the Israelites compromised? Have I put myself in a context or cultural situation that has made me amenable to things that God has said are wrong and has commanded against? Have I put myself in places that have allowed my heart to stray and the hearts of my family, the hearts of my church? And so my heart is heavy because I know that I am not perfect, and in some places I probably have. But in this situation, there was atonement that was made. And I think it's good to remind ourselves that you don't stand condemned today because of your sin if you have confessed Christ as your Lord and King. Christ died on the cross to make atonement for all of our sins so that we would be his children, that we would be made sons and daughters of God, that we would be right with him, and that we would live in the right relationship with him, in a very similar covenantal relationship with him. Numbers 25, 14 to 15. This is where we get a glimpse of the other guy. So actually in this text, there are two men that kind of stand in opposition to each other, and we've just talked about one of them, Phineas. Okay, but there's another guy. And it says, the name of the slain Israelite man who was struck dead with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. The name of the slain Midianite woman was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, a tribal head of a family in Midian. So you got two guys. Did you notice that it said Zimri was the leader of a Simeonite family? And Cosbi was the daughter of a tribal head of a family in Midian. Okay? Zimri and Cosby were not just youngsters in love. This was not a Romeo and Juliet situation, okay? Do not romanticize this text. That's not what's going on. They were leaders and instigators in this rebellion. The fact that they flaunted themselves in front of the temple shows that they wanted other people to follow them. They wanted everyone to know what was going on. Okay, Cosby would have been one of the women that was recruited to help execute Balaam's plan against Israel. Zimri is one of the men that should have been telling the Israelites not to give in to sin or temptation, and should have been telling them to stand against that and not participate. Okay? But he didn't, and she did. And so they stand condemned in the text, not for any imaginative leap of romanticizing the text. They were two people that loved each other. No, that's not what's going on here. They were leaders and instigators in the rebellion. So in this contrast, I think there's an aspect of the text that calls out to us and says, hey, are you going to be Phineas or Zimri? Because we are called to passionately pursue our relationship with God like Phineas. We are also called to not be like Zimri. He was transformed by the practices and values of the surrounding culture. Let me say that again. We are called to passionately pursue our relationship with God like Phineas. We are also called to not be like Zimri. He was transformed by the practices and the values of the surrounding culture. Now, I think that's a really important thing for us to understand, because we are caught in a culture today that has contrasting values, conflicting values with our Christian faith. Okay? And so when God commanded the Israelites not to make a treaty with the natives of the land, I think God has also called us not to make a treaty in our hearts with the natives of this culture. The last verses detail very concisely a war on temptation and sin. Numbers 25, 16 to 18. The Lord told Moses, attack the Midianites and strike them dead, for they attacked you with the treachery that they used against you in the Peor incident. They did the same in the case involving the sister Cosby, daughter of the Midianite leader, who was killed the day the plague came at Peor. Okay? So the Israelites were given a directive by the Lord to assail the Midianites because of their role in leading the people of God to abandon their covenant relationship. Let me tell you a little bit about what is coming. This section functions also as a precursor to the directive in Numbers 33, 50 to 56, in which the Lord instructed the Israelites to drive out the idolatrous Canaanites, lest these inhabitants of the promised land lead Israel into idolatry. God is using this as an opportunity to show the Israelites that if they're not careful when they go into the promised land, they will be susceptible to the same sin that killed 24,000 people in this incident. The reprisal against the Midianites would first be exacted soon after these directions in Numbers 25 were given, and that would be the last military leadership role carried out by Moses prior to his death in Numbers 31:2. Now, in that campaign with trumpets, which were made according to the Lord's instruction in Numbers 10, those trumpets would be sounded under the direction of Phineas. During the Midianite campaign, the prophet diviner Balaam, who had counseled Balak with regard to this means of deterring Israel's advance, would be killed, along with all the major Midianite chieftains. So this command that God gives, kind of what happens going out of that is Phinehas' role as a priest for Israel is established, and in that role, he helps lead the Israelites to victory. And also, God enacts judgment against Balaam because of that. So the Lord is dealing with the people that tried to destroy his people. Okay? And the story of the sin at Peor stands as a reminder throughout Israel's history. Because you notice that I was quoting from Revelation, from 2 Peter. We've quoted from Psalms. In just a little bit, I'm actually going to quote from Micah. There's passages in Hosea. The story of Balaam and Balak and the sin at Peor seasons Israel's history from this point forward. It stands as a warning, but also as a call for them to have the passion of Phineas and not to succumb to the culture and the people and the idolatry around them. Okay? In this text, this succumbing to the surrounding culture is exemplified in the dangers of intermarriage with women of the surrounding nations. That sort of compromise would open the Israelites to who embrace it to being led astray by the life practices of those women. So, this story calls us to do, I would say, three things. Reject any compromise of our covenant relationship with God. Okay, reject any compromise. Second, you've heard this, but be killing sin lest it be killing you. This is not be killing sinners. This is be killing sin, and this is an internal, I think, challenge that comes. We need to examine our lives regularly. I know one of the things that I've been examining or kind of praying about and meditating on, especially recently, has been the continual rise of homosexuality in our culture and our culture's embrace of that. And it has permeated a lot of entertainment, of our entertainment industry. And the thing that's insidious about our entertainment industry is it paints the world in a specific light. When we're watching things on Netflix, on TV, and all that other things, that's an entertainment medium, and it's kind of like the easy candy, okay, of our lives. But in that, it also delivers a worldview. And if we're not actively attacking that in our hearts, I think we are susceptible to imagining the world in their way. Does that make sense? And so, this is one of the things where I'm trying to be, and I've tried to be, and I'm trying to be even more so in the future, one of those wonderful people that'll like comment on the movie or the show while I'm watching it with my boys. I used to do that a lot, and I realized I hadn't done it a lot, so my boys are going to hate watching TV and movies with me here after this. But for us to be aware, hey, that stuff that's going on right there, like they portrayed it as okay and as acceptable, but actually, those in real life, those would be two broken people whose lives would be devastated and breaking all around them. And their actions would put them at odds with God's will for their life and God's heart for who they are. And so we are not called to accept that like this movie does, like this YouTuber does, like this streamer does, like this Twitter person, like this TikTok person. Like all these different mediums and stuff that are out there, they have ways of conveying these things, and it's seasoned in there, and we need to be killing it in our hearts. And in that, you need to give up on our need for earthly pleasures. And this is something, I read something recently. It said, you don't need, and this was convicting, you don't need to watch any movies. You don't need to watch any shows. You know what? You'll be perfectly okay. Your life will be perfectly fine if you don't ever watch another movie in your life. That's hard for me to hear because I got some movies I really like. Okay? But it's good for us to realize that, because then when we look at our options, we can say, is it worth it? Is it worth it to put myself there? Okay. So in closing, I'm going to read from Micah 6, 5 to 8. The prophet is using the story of the sin at Peor to call to his people. It says, my people, remember what King Balak of Moab proposed, what Balaam son of Peor answered him, and what happened from the acacia grove to Gilgal, so that you may acknowledge the Lord's righteous act. So the prophet says, remember. Then he asks, what should I bring before the Lord when I come to bow before God on high? Should I come before him with burnt offerings, with year-old calves? Would the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000 streams of oil? Should I give my firstborn for my transgression, the offspring of my body for my own sin? Mankind, this is the prophet, says, mankind, he has told each of you what is good and what it is the Lord requires of you. And this has become one of my kind of life verses here. It says, what has God called us to do in response to the story of the sin at Peor? It's right here. It says, to act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with our God. To act justly. Can we act justly? Can we love faithfulness? And I would say that the Israelites failed because their love of pleasure eclipsed their love of faithfulness. And to walk humbly with our God. Not as arrogant people who have it together, but humbly knowing that if not for the cross, we would be forsaken. We would be lost. So, now we're going to enter time. The praise team is going to come forward to sing a song. And I want to encourage you, as they sing this song, take a moment before you open your mouth to sing, to examine your heart and pray. And this is what I want to encourage you as you pray. Number one, if there are areas in your life that God has been convicting you about, confess them to God now. You don't have to say it out loud, but I do want you to address them at least in your heart. Okay? Confess them. And there may be some areas where you're like, God, I don't know, I feel like I'm okay, but this might be a sin, and I'm thinking about it now, so maybe you're putting it on me. God, help me figure out how to navigate this. But also, as we kind of pray and deal with this, I want to encourage you, and I want to remind you that if you have confessed Christ as King, your sins are forgiven. So this working out that is happening right now is the working out of our salvation. This sermon that was given was not given to condemn you. It was given to challenge you, to excel still more in those areas where you are doing well, but to also be cognizant of, to be aware of those areas where you might be failing. Or you might be naive. Maybe God's made you think of something today that you had never considered before. And so I want you to understand that as you confess your sin, God is faithful and just. He will forgive us our sins. And He has made that possible through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Let's stand to our feet and we'll pray. Father, we thank you. We thank you for Christ who died on the cross for us, that we might be sons and daughters of the King. Lord, all of us have sin in our lives. None of us are worthy on our own to stand before your throne, to be a part of your family. But you loved us so much that you made a way in Christ for us to be yours. Father, we rejoice in that. And Lord, as we take these final moments of this service to examine our hearts, Lord, I pray that you would put your finger on our heart, that you would get some work done, and that our hearts would be like clay in your hand, that you would have your way with us. Father, we thank you and we love you.